As an athlete and a coach, feedback is one of those things that I enjoyed having, but I always saw it as negative. As an athlete, when you get feedback, you've got the good things, things that you did well, and then things that you did wrong. I recognise through coach education and through being an athlete, it changes, and now I think it's room for improvement or areas for improvement. But as an athlete, I always felt this was something that I'd done wrong, and as a coach, it was pointing out mistakes or errors that someone had made or someone was doing. But feedback and criticism somewhat relate in that most of the feedback that I was really paying attention to was the criticism, i.e. sticky criticism. Now, why is criticism more sticky than the good things? When people complimented me, it was nice to hear, it was great, and when I gave good feedback, positive feedback, the people that I was coaching didn't tend to pay attention to the good bit, they focused on the negative bit. And as an adult and as a coach developing and understanding the psychology of learning, education, and individuals, criticism is sticky because we have a negativity bias, or at least that's the research that I saw, found, and looked into. But the negativity bias seems, obviously, negative, but somewhat related to threat. And criticism, I think, is related to threat, or at least perceived threat that we think might be happening. As an athlete, I saw the feedback as threat because, oh, I'm going to lose my spot on the team because that person is better than me, or I'm making lots of mistakes, so maybe people are going to disagree with me, frown at me, or make fun of me for making mistakes. And the mistakes and the errors and the pointing of the errors that I made being a potential threat, both socially, because you're going to get people talking about you or potentially talking behind your back and saying, oh, they made this mistake or they missed that shot or how did they not defend in this way or they messed up that routine. So a social threat, but also a developmental threat when it comes to the team and skill development and progress. Oh, I'm not as good as that person. Comparison, social comparison, I guess you could class that as social, but a comparison between your development and someone else's development, which I feel as a coach now is up to the culture that we create. And the culture that we create around threat comes into psychological safety. It's a concept I learnt about in my undergrad at university, and creating a psychologically safe environment is far easier said than done. I hear in coach education courses that you need to create a psychologically safe environment, but what does that actually look like? There's a lot of talking about things, knowledge about what psychological safety is, but what is knowledge of? Like the knowledge of being in a psychologically safe environment. As an athlete, I haven't really felt safe in many organised sports environments because of the feedback, the sticky criticism that I was given. And it was open to everyone. How do I not, as a coach, make it so negative, so congested? That's how at least I felt as an athlete. What I found out is there's an article from Steve Magness written years ago that he had actually discussed sticky criticism, hence the title of the video, and there was a study in it about depressed individuals. So the study looked at depressed individuals and how they reacted to positive and negative feedback. Those depressed, feeling somewhat threatened, potentially by the environments they were experiencing, actually showed more brain activation for criticism. I feel like that's a fairly expected result, but also that the positive results were somewhat null, they were insignificant. So those that were depressed in this study focused more on criticism, but we already know we have a negativity bias from the research that I've just sort of shared and discussed in my experiences as well. Where I got interested when reading this article again is that, okay, does it work the other way? So when discussing psychological safety, if you're in a psychologically safe environment, do you now focus more on the positive feedback or maybe neutral feedback instead of giving someone praise all of the time? If it's a psychologically safe environment we've created as the coach, do the individuals now focus on the positive things? I haven't found a study on it yet, but speaking from my experience, what I tend to do when I give, I don't know if I would class it as feedback, but when I give questions or exploratory practice, people tend to, the individuals I've worked with over the last few months, focus on the things that they did, the challenges they completed. And this relates to the way that I give feedback. I wouldn't say I give feedback to individuals. I give them a challenge, and then they can either complete the challenge or find ways to complete the challenge. The challenges being practice design with constraints. This comes from ecological dynamics and the constraints-led approach to coaching. There's lots of other jargon involved in that, but essentially I ask an individual, can you do this thing? And if they can't, they try and figure out how to do it. And the feedback is transferable feedback. If they complete it, they've done it, that I don't need to tell them that I've done it. But then if they can't do it or they struggle to do it, they're learning through it, so the feedback is working out how to do it. If they get to a point where they give up, I don't say this is how you do it. I don't give them an answer, which could be feedback. You're doing this wrong, so you need to do this thing instead. Or have you tried doing this thing is another type of feedback, I guess. But it's more of an open question than what I would class as traditional feedback. Obviously, labels are, or meanings are in people, not words, so the labels can be somewhat different depending on what your experience is as a coach. So when I'm giving feedback, if I can class it as feedback, I'm asking the individual to add a constraint or potentially explore and focus on something else, different information. So more tangibly, if they're trying to land a front somersault on the trampoline, I may say, okay, well, what are you looking at? I ask them a question. What are they looking at when they come round? For those familiar with doing somersaults on a trampoline or coaching trampoline, ideally you'd want to be looking for the trampoline so you know you want to land on your feet. If you're not looking, well, now I've asked a question for them to look. And this, I think, relates to some of the feedback that I used to be given as an athlete. I was given feedback on, you need to do this thing, or you're doing this thing wrong, or can you try and do this differently? But my focus was on something completely different, which is where asking questions instead of giving feedback allows the individual to sort of consider their own feedback, if that makes sense. This is the way that I'm thinking about it, at least. So the criticism from the psychologically safe environment is somewhat removed because I'm not critiquing errors. I'm not pointing out mistakes because I'm not pointing out anything. I'm asking them what they're paying attention to, and if what they're paying attention to is helping them with their intention of whatever the task is, be it the somersault. If I say you need to focus on the end deck when they come round, that's a valid piece of feedback. But if they're focused on trying to make themselves feel floaty going up in the somersault, they're not really focused on what they're looking at. So the feedback, the criticism, is somewhat redundant. Then heading on back to the Steve Magness article, they also referenced a study with school individuals, kids at school, and the praise effect, criticism, and praise being not necessarily encouraged or promoted or wanted more, it's just had more of an effect at the beginning of the year, whereas criticism had more of an effect towards the end of the year. And I don't feel like there was a good cause or rationale given to that, apart from the relationship between the individual and the exam, which I feel comes back to that perceived threat. Children perceiving a closer threat, focusing more on the criticism, focusing more on the errors, because they don't want to make the errors and obviously be threatened. And on the other side of that, again relating to the praise, because the praise is further away from the exam, they're less likely to focus, or they're more likely to focus on the good things, which psychologically safe environment, if we're giving feedback on those things, then obviously praise is not going to be as encouraged, because I would imagine they're thinking on the criticism, if that makes sense. So when I'm going into a coaching environment, culture, scenario, whatever you want to call it, I'm not focused on the threat, the exam, the competition, the match as something that they need to pay attention to, they being participants. It's something that happens, but until you get into a performance stage, there's no real need to practice for XYZ competition, which obviously comes into long-term athlete development, how you choose to develop individuals, and conversations about ages, maturations, playing experience, sporting experience, transferable skills, and the goals of the individual. Because if you're working with someone that doesn't want to perform or compete, then why increase this potential perceived threat for them in competition, i.e. making a mistake and making themselves look silly, if they don't want to do that in the first place? So that's, again, a coaching philosophy that I personally take to avoid the perceived threat of competition. However, if competition is something that they want to do, then how do you deal with that? And I think that's addressing how to give feedback for performance development rather than correcting mistakes and errors. And even for adults, they might not have an exam, but they might have work or social friends that they want to keep or anything else that could be perceived as threatening. So it doesn't have to be a test or a competition. It could just be social interactions with other people. You don't want to be kicked out of the friendship group for making someone look silly or being offensive or anything like that. So people avoid certain criticism, or they avoid sharing certain criticisms, or try and navigate how to talk in the right way, which I think relates to some of the closed nature of communication at the moment that I'm seeing with individuals that I work with. They don't want to say the wrong thing. So from my experience, I sit there and think, okay, I want to say this, but I can't use this word because they might think this. I can't use that word because they might think that. I shouldn't really say it like this because they could think this thing, but if they think this thing, then I might think that I need to say it in another way. And all of this is going on internally while I'm discussing with myself how to actually communicate something to someone else because of perceived threats. All of this to say that the sandwich technique that I've seen people use and I've heard recommended quite a few times now in coach education, where you give praise, you give something positive, then you give a critique or an error or a mistake, and then you do another praise thing, it just doesn't work. The research that I've seen, it doesn't work. People will either focus on the criticism because they perceive a threat, or they'll focus on the praise because that's the mindset they're in, the relationship that they are in with the environment that they're working within. And I think the environment that we're working in, i.e. the culture of the sport, the club, the practice, the competition, maybe even because some competitions can be fun, I think that is more likely to encourage individuals to develop and stay within physical activity than leave. And of course, everyone is going to be sensitive to when and how and who gives the feedback. I know when I was at a competition, if I messed up, I didn't really want to hear the coach say, oh, you did this wrong in skill 6, which is why you crashed on skill 7, or you should have pointed your toes over here so you can get better scores to win. I don't want to hear that if I've just come fourth and missed out on medals, or I've just crashed and lost, or if I've just missed an open goal in football. I really don't care about feedback at that point. And understanding the feeling as an athlete, I think, has helped me share feedback at appropriate times as a coach, but it's an art of coaching. Yes, obviously there's science, there's research, there's evidence involved, but the art of coaching is navigating human interactions, which I certainly don't get right all of the time. I probably make lots of mistakes, but I'm not aware of those mistakes unless I communicate those. Mistakes being things where I could have been more effective. Not necessarily wrong, just less effective as I could have been. But of course there's loads of different ways to do that, and this is kind of like just a riff on sticky criticism. Let me know if this is interesting and how you approach giving feedback, sharing feedback, or sharing skill development conversations with individuals that you work with, whether that be coaching children, coaching adults, or coaching other coaches, or teaching. I don't know. But yeah, let me know in the comment section below, because I'd be intrigued to see how other people approach feedback, criticism, and perceived threat in the cultures and environments that we're working in.